I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to Vampire Read-Throughs, where I read you vampire stories for your amusement. Tonight, we discuss yet another early work of vampire fiction that happens to be in the public domain, which means I can read you the entire thing here on YouTube while we discuss it. Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. What's Dracula's Guest, you ask? Is it Dracula? Is it part of Dracula? Is it something different from Dracula? We all know Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, which came out in 1997, and there are plenty of other vampire stories that came before. Why, last time we discussed Polydori's The Vampire with a Y, one of the most influential early works of vampire fiction from which Bram Stoker borrowed heavily when he wrote Dracula. But Dracula's Guest is an interesting short story that was published in 1914, after Bram Stoker's death. While Bram Stoker was on his deathbed, he was putting together 3 collections of short stories, and Bram Stoker wrote a lot of stories and books besides Dracula. You probably haven't heard of most of them, but he did. He was very prolific, so he was putting together these collections of short stories that had all been previously published in magazines and stuff, and he had 3 volumes, and then he died. So his wife, Florence, took them, and she said, well, I'm going to publish them. I think Bram was probably going to edit them and make them better because they were his early works, but he died before he had the chance, so I'm not going to edit them. I'm just going to publish them as is. And the first was Dracula's Guests and Other Stories. But the interesting thing about the Dracula's Guests story is that Bram didn't originally intend to include it in the collection. Florence included it herself. And she says in the introduction to the original collection that she published in 1914 that Dracula's Guests was originally part of Dracula that got excised from the manuscript due to length at the publisher's request. However, many Dracula scholars think she might have been wrong about that. There is so much mystery and speculation surrounding the story Dracula's Guest. Because it is a short story, you can't usually just buy it by itself. It's only about 20 pages long, but you can find it in collections. You can find that original 1914 Dracula's Guest and Other Stories, or it's republished in just about every vampire anthology that wants to fill up its pages with public domain works and make it seem longer. I have it in several editions. Vampire Stories, edited by Richard Dalby, with an introduction by Peter Cushing. This edition has 18 stories, and it's got the public domain classics like Dracula's Guest, along with a lot more contemporary works by Anne Rice and a bunch of other people you probably haven't heard of. It also exists in my copy of Vampires, Wine, and Roses, Chilling Tales of Immortal Pleasure. And this is a really pretty book. I just love this book. It's got blue font, which kind of makes it hard to read, but some good artwork, some nice design. Edited by John Richard Stevens, illustrated by Vincent Locke. All your classic public domain stuff, along with a couple contemporary stories. One by Woody Allen, one by Stephen King, but most of them very old things, and a lot that are arguably not even vampire stories, but are kind of vampire-ish, which are interesting. It also includes that Anne Rice story, The Master of Rambling Gate, but another one by Anne Rice that you don't usually see in these collections called The Ballad of the Sad Rat. Of course, it's also in the Vampire Super Pack, which I mentioned last time when we discussed The Vampire with a Y. 42 stories. A lot of more modern contemporary authors in here, but again, it does fill up its pages with the classics. And it's in my copy of Gothic Fantasy, Bram Stoker Horror Stories. This is a really beautiful book. It's got all the silver on it, and it's full of all of Bram Stoker's short stories. All the ones you've probably never realized he wrote because he's only ever known for Dracula. And they're divided into different categories, which I like. You got supernatural foes, murder and revenge, love and tragedy. Dracula's Guest is in supernatural foes. And this is a brand new book that I've just acquired. It's called Vampires, 2 Centuries of Great Vampire Stories, edited by Alan Ryan. A lot of these books all have the same exact stories in them, but they have interesting new introductions and forwards and afterwards, and usually before each story there's a little bit of a blurb about the author so you can learn some interesting history. So I always collect all these short story collections about vampires. So back to the mystery. So, people assume from what Florence wrote in her introduction to Dracula's Guest and other short stories that she published, even though Bram Stoker didn't originally plan to put Dracula's Guest in that compilation, she added it herself, that Dracula's Guest was originally the first chapter of Dracula. And the publisher told Stoker his draft was too long. He chopped out the first chapter and started it where it starts. So Dracula starts, the edition of Dracula that's in the public domain that everyone's read, the English edition, starts with Jonathan Harker writing in his journal on his way to Transylvania. He's on a train going to Budapest and then past there on his way to Transylvania. Dracula's Guest starts with Harker earlier in his journey. Harker admits at one point that he went from England to Paris, from Paris to Munich, from Munich to Budapest, and then on to Transylvania from there. So this chapter takes place when he's in Munich. And it takes place a few days before the beginning of Dracula. Beginning of Dracula starts the beginning of May. May 4th is the first date we see, and this starts on April 23rd, 24th. Also, in one of Bram Stoker's manuscripts that was found after he died, people noticed that his manuscript started on page 100-something. And it started with a note for chapter 2 and then chapter 3. So there was a missing chapter 1. And they thought, well, this 100 pages of missing stuff was the original chapter 1. Dracula's Guest is only 20 pages, so there's still 80 pages out there missing. But surely Dracula's Guest, you could just plop it right in front of the existing beginning of Dracula, and that's where it belongs. But a lot of people disagree with this. They think that's not true. And there's a lot of controversy among all the Dracula nerds, scholars. And if you look at parts of the original draft of Dracula, you can see references to Dracula's Guest, so we know that Dracula's Guest was part of Dracula at one point. However, it took Bram Stoker 7 years to write Dracula. It went through multiple drafts, and the final version we got, scholars believe, likely didn't include Dracula's Guest at all. It wasn't just a chopped out first chapter. Also, there's parts of Dracula's Guest that are in Dracula. So clearly Stoker revised this, included parts of it into Dracula the way he has it start. He took bits of this original beginning, put it in. It wasn't a chapter that was just chopped off, otherwise he wouldn't have repeated those bits. They wouldn't have shown up twice. And part of what's gone into, I won't say solving this mystery, but getting involved in this mystery is the powers of darkness, which you may be familiar with because there's been a tweet thing going around that you may have seen. I know I sure have because everyone keeps sending it to me. But despite what this joke says, the powers of darkness was not a Icelandic translator just simply taking Dracula and making up incredible fan fiction and publishing their own thing. Go read the Wikipedia page for Powers of Darkness. It is a trip and a half. Or you could just read the introduction to this because it explains it all in here. So what people believe is that the Icelandic translation of Dracula was translated from a different draft of Dracula. Even though it came after the English one was released, they believe Bram Stoker gave the translator an older draft of Dracula that he may have liked better because it was sexier. Boils down to it being sexier. And more dramatic, more bloody, more violent, more sacrilegious. There's sacrificial rituals and stuff. And he couldn't get that published in England, or he didn't think he could because the English were so prudish and Dracula couldn't be too sexy and the women couldn't be seduced by him. They had to be repulsed by him. So he had this older version, this different draft of Dracula that he gave to this translator and said, you should use this when you translate it to Icelandic and publish it in your magazine instead. And then we think that the translator took this, worked with Bram Stoker, developed it, tossed in some Norse mythology and Icelandic references as a sprinkling, but most of the weird differences were Stoker's own original ideas, and people have found proof of this. There's cross-references, there's bases in Stoker's original life, references, the changed names are based on people that he knew personally. So it's not fanfic. The Norse references and the Icelandic setting references probably were added by the translator, but those are very minimal. It was Stoker's original brain baby. One of the main differences between this and Dracula in English is that the part where Jonathan Harker's writing in his journal at the castle with Dracula, with the 3 vampire brides, dealing with all that, is expanded. So it's about 22,000 words in the original Dracula. It's like 37,000 words here. So it's expanded. And it's a lot sexier. Jonathan is a lot more attracted to the vampire brides. He's a lot more seduced. He actually gets involved with one of them and has repeated encounters with her. And then the part that comes after, which is like 100-something thousand words in Dracula, is only 9,000 words in this. So they took the whole rest of the story, the part that takes place in England, and just crunched it down into 9,000 words summary. And people say it's very not well written, to be generous. People think that maybe by that point the translator decided, or the magazine that was publishing it decided they needed to get it finished with quickly, so that's where they took over and just chopped it down and summarized it. But the beginning part, the part in Dracula's castle, people think was Stoker's original intention for the story, that he chose to change in order to make it more in accordance with the puritanical ideas of England. Dracula in this is a libertine. He's much more warlordy. He's not very classy. The women are a lot sexier. The prudish Englishman is a lot more susceptible to their sexiness. You can see why people would think it was fanficky, but apparently that was just Stoker's original idea, at least for a draft of Dracula. However, Dracula's guest, the reason why we're here today, it's not in this either. There were multiple drafts of Dracula. It took him 7 years to write it. Writers revise things all the time. Dracula's guest was something he wrote that didn't end up in Dracula. And bits of it did, but it probably wasn't just chopped off the first chapter, like some people would like to believe. So what is it? Well, let's read it together and find out. I will be reading to you from the Vampire Super Pack because the font is the largest. Now, this doesn't say from the journal of Jonathan Harker like Dracula does. It doesn't even say who the first-person narrator is. However, because it is written in first person by an unnamed narrator, we can assume it could have been a journal entry. Although, in Powers of Darkness, there is no epistolary format. So maybe it was before that was developed when he wrote it, before Bram Stoker decided to make his novel epistolary, and it was just in first person. Hard to say. But we are to assume this is Harker speaking, even though it never tells us that. And we are to assume this is when he is on his way through Munich before he gets to the next stop in his journey to Transylvania. When we started on our drive, the sun was shining brightly on Munich, and the air was full of joyousness of early summer. Just as we were about to depart, Herr Delbruck, the maitre d'hotel of the Quatre Saisons where I was staying, came down bareheaded to the carriage, and, after wishing me a pleasant drive, said to the coachman, still holding his hand on the handle of the carriage door, "Remember you are back by nightfall. The sky looks bright, but there is a shiver in the north wind that says there may be a sudden storm. But I am sure you will not be late." Here he smiled and added, "For you know what night it is." Johann answered with an empathetic "Ja, mein Herr," and touched his hat, drove off quickly. When we had cleared the town, I said, after signaling him to stop, "Tell me, Johann, what is tonight?" He crossed himself as he answered laconically, "Valpurgis Nacht." And then he took out his watch, a great old-fashioned German silver thing as big as a turnip, and looked at it, with his eyebrows gathered together and a little impatient shrug of his shoulders. I realized that this was his way of respectfully protesting against the unnecessary delay, and sank back in the carriage, merely motioning him to proceed. He started off rapidly, as if to make up for lost time. Every now and then the horses seemed to throw up their heads and sniffed the air suspiciously. On such occasions I often looked round in alarm. The road was pretty bleak, for we were traversing a sort of high, wind-swept plateau. As we drove, I saw a road that looked but little used, which seemed to dip through a little winding valley. It looked so inviting that, even at the risk of offending him, I called Johann to stop, and when he had pulled up, I told him I would like to drive down that road. He made all sorts of excuses, and frequently crossed himself as he spoke. This somewhat piqued my curiosity, so I asked him various questions. He answered fencingly, and repeatedly looked at his watch in protest. Finally I said, "Well, Johann, I want to go down this road. I shall not ask you to come unless you like, but tell me why you do not like to go. That is all I ask." For answer, he seemed to throw himself off the box. So quickly did he reach the ground. Then he stretched out his hands appealingly to me and implored me not to go. There was just enough English mixed with the German for me to understand the drift of his talk. He seemed always just about to tell me something, the very idea of which evidently frightened him, but each time he pulled himself up, saying as he crossed himself, "Valpurgis Nacht." For those of you who don't know, Valpurgis Nacht is a holiday which comes before the day of Saint Valpurgia, and Valpurgis Nacht is known as the night that witches gather and frolic, ostensibly to banish evil spirits, or if you're a pearl clutcher, to maybe frolic with the evil spirits. Valpurgis Nacht was depicted in Fantasia, in the best sequence of the movie, the Night on Bald Mountain sequence, where we see Chernabog frolicking with his demons on Valpurgis Nacht. I guess think of it like an old-timey Halloween. The day after is supposed to be a holy day, but the night before, anything goes. It's interesting to see the story make such a big deal of it being Valpurgis Nacht, because Dracula, the English version that we have, starts with Jonathan Harker going on a carriage ride to Dracula's castle, but it happens to be St. George's Eve, the night before St. George's Day, which usually happens in April, but in Dracula it happens on May 4th, because St. George's Day is May 5th on the Georgian calendar. And the eve of St. George's Day is a big deal in Dracula, because between midnight and dawn, before St. George's Day, all the evil creatures go out and about and try to do all their evil deeds because they are banished at dawn. And Dracula uses that night to follow the St. Elmo's fire and find all the hidden treasures that's buried around his castle. And he's driving Jonathan in his carriage, though Jonathan doesn't know it's Dracula. He just thinks it's the driver. And the driver keeps stopping the carriage and going out towards the blue flames and marking them so he can come back and dig up the buried treasure later. So I wonder if Jonathan was supposed to go out and do dumb stuff on Valpurgis Nacht and St. George's Eve, or if Bram Stoker originally was going to do this Valpurgis Nacht thing, and then because he didn't include this in the final version of Dracula, did the St. George's Eve thing instead. Oh, I wouldn't put it past Jonathan to do both. I mean, he saw a road, and he said, "I really want to go down that road," and the driver said, "No, dude, don't go down that road," but he wouldn't tell him why, except Valpurgis Nacht. But as we all know, Englishmen aren't superstitious, and Valpurgis Nacht means nothing to them. Witches aren't real. I tried to argue with him, but it was difficult to argue with a man when I did not know his language. The advantage certainly rested with him, for although he began to speak English of a very crude and broken kind, he always got excited and broke into his native tongue, and every time he did so, he looked at his watch. Then the horses became restless and sniffed the air. At this, he grew very pale, and looking around in a frightened way, he suddenly jumped forward, took them by the bridles, and led them on some 20 feet. I followed, and asked why he had done this. For answer, he crossed himself, pointed to the spot we had left, and drew his carriage in the direction of the other road, indicating a cross, and said, first in German, then in English, "Buried him what killed themselves." I remembered the old custom of burying suicides at a crossroads. Ah, I see, a suicide. How interesting. But for the life of me, I could not make out why the horses were frightened. Whilst we were talking, we heard a sort of sound between a yelp and a bark. It was far away, but the horses got very restless, and it took Johann all his time to quiet them. He was pale and said, "It sounds like a wolf, but yet there are no wolves here now." "No?" I said, questioning him. "Isn't it long since the wolves were so near the city?" "Long, long," he answered, "in the spring and summer, but with the snow the wolves have been here not so long." Whilst he was petting the horses and trying to quiet them, dark clouds drifted rapidly across the sky. The sunshine passed away, and a breath of cold wind seemed to drift past us. I like that. The sunshine passed away. It's like it died. It was only a breath, however, and more in the nature of a warning than a fact, for the sun came out brightly again. Johann looked under his lifted hand at the horizon and said, "The storm of snow, he comes before long time." Then he looked at his watch again, and straightway holding his reins firmly, for the horses were still pawing the ground restlessly and shaking their heads, he climbed to his box as though the time had come for proceeding on our journey. I felt a little obstinate and did not at once get into the carriage. "Tell me," I said, "about this place where the road leads," and I pointed down. Again he crossed himself and mumbled a prayer before he answered, "It is unholy." "What is unholy?" I inquired. "The village." "Then there is a village?" No one lives there hundreds of years." My curiosity was piqued. "But you said there was a village." "There was." "Where is it now?" Whereupon he burst into a long story in German and English, so mixed up that I could not quite understand exactly what he said, but roughly I gathered that long ago, hundreds of years, men had died there and been buried in their graves, and sounds were heard under the clay. And when the graves were open, men and women were found rosy with life, and their mouths red with blood. And so, in haste to save their lives, aye, and their souls, and here he crossed himself, those who were left fled away to other places, where the living lived, and the dead were dead, and not something. He was evidently afraid to speak the last words. As he proceeded with his narration, he grew more and more excited. It seemed as if his imagination had got hold of him, and he ended a perfect paroxysm of fear, white-faced, perspiring, trembling and looking round him, as if expecting that some dreadful presence would manifest itself there in the bright sunshine on the open plain. Finally, in an agony of desperation, he cried, "Valpurgis Nacht!" and he pointed to the carriage for me to get in. All my English blood rose at this, and standing back, I said, "You are afraid, Johann. You are afraid. Go home. I shall remain alone. The walk will do me good." The carriage door was open. I took from the seat my oak walking stick, which I always carry on my holiday excursions, and closed the door, pointing back to Munich, and said, "Go home, Johann. Valpurgis Nacht does not concern Englishmen. Just because we don't believe in superstitions means they're not real." It's interesting that Harker is, making this journey to Transylvania, ostensibly to do his legal real estate business with Dracula, but he's stopping in Munich, and he's just kind of going out for a joyride this day with this Johann guy. It doesn't say why he's going for a ride, but since the hotel maitre d' was like, make sure you're back before dark, it seems like it's just something he was going to do for the day. And yet Johann doesn't want to take him to the part of the scenery he wants to see. I mean, you have an unholy village full of graves of rosy-cheeked vampire-like things, I don't blame him. But all of Harker's English blood rose at this. His pride came out, and he said, "Because you are being superstitious, now I have to go down the creepy road you told me not to go to. Otherwise I wouldn't be an Englishman." The horses were now more restive than ever, and Johann was trying to hold them in while excitedly imploring me not to do anything so foolish. I pitied the poor fellow. He was deeply in earnest. Oh, how dumb he must be to care so much. But all the same, I could not help that his only means of making me understand was to talk my language, so he jabbered away in his native German. It began to be a little tedious. After giving the direction, "home," I turned to go down the crossroad into the valley. With a despairing gesture, Johann turned his horses toward Munich. I leaned on my stick and looked after him. He went slowly along the road for a while. Then there came over the crest of the hill a man, tall and thin. I could see so much in the distance. When he drew near the horses, they began to jump and kick about, then to scream with terror. Johann could not hold them in. They bolted down the road, running away madly. I watched them out of sight, then looked for the stranger, but I found that he, too, was gone. Who could the stranger be, walking on the road that scared the horses and then disappeared? Keeping in mind that we're in Munich, so it's not going to be Dracula, right? Because Dracula's in Transylvania, and he picks up Harker in the carriage on that road. Another reason why this probably wasn't just the first chapter of Dracula chopped off, because there's too many things that are similar, and why would the same thing happen twice with the horses being freaked out by the stranger, who is probably obviously a vampire of some kind, showing up? I'm in the camp that believes more that this was reworked into what Dracula eventually became. With a light heart, I turned down the side road through the deepening valley to which Johann had objected. Light heart, you moron! You just saw the horses freak out and run away from a spooky stranger who disappeared in the night, and you got a light heart. Okay, yeah, I'm not rooting for you yet. If anything bad's gonna happen to this guy, he probably deserves it. There was not the slightest reason that I could see for his objection, and I dare say I tramped for a couple of hours without thinking of time or distance, and certainly without seeing a person or a house. So far as the place was concerned, it was desolation itself. But I did not notice this particularly till, on turning a bend in the road, I came upon a scattered fringe of wood. Then I recognized that I had been impressed unconsciously by the desolation of the region through which I had passed. I sat down to rest myself and began to look around. It struck me that it was considerably colder than it had been at the commencement of my walk. A sort of sighing sound seemed to be around me, with, now and then, high overhead, a sort of muffled roar. Looking upwards, I noticed that great thick clouds were drifting rapidly across the sky from north to south at a great height. There were signs of a coming storm in some lofty stratum of the air. I was a little chilly, and thinking that it was the sitting still after the exercise of walking, I resumed my journey. Of course, that's the only reason you're a little chilly. It couldn't be like a bad omen or anything. Pshaw. The ground I passed over was now much more picturesque. There were no striking objects that the eye might single out, but in all there was a charm of beauty. I took little heed of time, and it was only with the deepening twilight forced itself upon me that I began to think of how I should find my way home. Oh, yeah, only then. You've been walking for hours and you're just now like, getting home in the dark might be hard. One of the things people notice between Powers of Darkness, the Icelandic translation of Dracula, and actual Dracula is that Harker in Powers of Darkness seems to be a lot more dumb, and he's a lot sharper. In Dracula, he's a lot more mature, and seeing how he's acting in this book, yes, I know at the beginning of Dracula he's dismissive of the peasants and their superstition, but he's not winning any favors in this book, so maybe this was from a similar early draft, same as Powers of Darkness draft was from, back before Harker's character personality was really developed. The brightness of the day had gone. The air was cold, and the drifting of clouds high overhead was more marked. They were accompanied by a sort of faraway rushing sound, through which seemed to come at intervals that mysterious cry which the driver had said came from a wolf. For a while I hesitated. I had said I would see the deserted village, so on I went and presently came on a wide stretch of open country, shut in by hills all around. Of course, 'cause once you say you're going to do something, if you back down, why, that would make you look weak and not English. Their sides were covered with trees, which spread down to the plain, dotting in clumps the gentler slopes and hollows which showed here and there. I followed with my eye the winding of the road, and saw that it curved close to one of the densest of these clumps, and was lost behind it. As I looked, there came a cold shiver in the air, and the snow began to fall. I thought of the miles and miles of bleak country I had passed, and then hurried on to seek the shelter of the wood in front. Darker and darker grew the sky, and faster and heavier fell the snow, till the earth before and around me was glistening white carpet, the further edge of which was lost in the misty vagueness. Oh, dude, you're in trouble now. The road was here but crude, and when on the level its boundaries were not so marked as when it passed through the cuttings, and in a little while I found that I must have strayed from it, for I missed underfoot the hard surface, and my feet sank deeper in the grass and moss. Then the wind grew stronger, and blew with ever-increasing force, till I was fain to run before it. The air became icy cold, and in spite of my exercise I began to suffer. The snow was now falling so thickly and whirling around me in such rapid eddies that I could hardly keep my eyes open. Every now and then the heavens were torn asunder by vivid lightning, and in the flashes I could see ahead of me a great mess of trees, chiefly yew and cypress, all heavily coated with snow. So this is the second vampire story we've read on Vampire Read-Throughs, where a dude who thinks he's probably immortal and not going to come to victim on going on a dumb walk when the peasants have told him not to do it, gets caught in a storm. In The Vampire with a Y, it was a thunder rainstorm, and now in this one, Dracula's guest, it's a snowstorm. I wonder what's going to happen to this guy. Perhaps something similar to what happened to our friend in The Vampire with a Y? We all know Bram Stoker was influenced by The Vampire with a Y, but usually it's with the assumption that he took the archetype of the vampire being a person with a personality and goals and who could blend into society instead of just being like a graveyard wraith monster. And that was the main thing he took from that, because that's what everyone took from Polydori's The Vampire. But This exact scene of a guy walking on foot and getting caught in a storm is a bit more derivative than I expected. I was soon amongst the shelter of the trees, and there, in comparative silence, I could hear the rush of the wind high overhead. Presently, the blackness of the storm had become merged in the darkness of the night. By and by, the storm seemed to be passing away. It now only came in fierce puffs or blasts. At such moment, the weird sound of the wolf appeared to be echoed by many similar sounds around me. Now and again, through the black mass of drifting cloud came a straggling ray of moonlight, which lit up the expanse and showed me that I was at the edge of a dense mass of cypress and yew trees. As the snow had ceased to fall, I walked out from the shelter and began to investigate more closely. It appeared to me that, amongst so many old foundations as I had passed, there might still be standing a house in which, though in ruins, I could find some sort of shelter for a while. Oh yes, just like our friend Aubrey in The Vampire, he goes and he finds shelter in a house that's deserted and probably full of vampire activity. As I skirted the edge of the copse, I found that a low wall encircled it, and following this, I presently found an opening. Here, the cypresses formed an alley leading up to a square mass of some kind of building. Just as I caught sight of this, however, the drifting clouds obscured the moon, and I passed up the path in darkness. The wind must have grown colder, for I felt myself shiver as I walked, but there was hope of shelter, and I groped my way blindly on. I like that. It's like the wind must have grown colder, and that's why I was shivering. It's not because I was scared. It's not because I did something dumb, and I'm probably about to run into some vampire activity on Valpurgis Nacht of all nachts. The wind was just colder, that's all. I stopped, for there was a sudden stillness. The storm had passed, and perhaps in sympathy with nature's silence, my heart seemed to cease to beat. But this was only momentarily, for suddenly the moonlight broke through the clouds, showing me that I was in a graveyard, and that the square object before me was a great, massive tomb of marble, as white as the snow that lay on it and all around it. With the moonlight there came a fierce sigh of the storm, which appeared to resume its course with a long, low howl, as of many dogs or wolves. I was awed and shocked, and felt the cold perceptibly grow upon me till it seemed to grip me by the heart. Then, while the flood of moonlight still fell on the marble tomb, the storm gave further evidence of renewing, as though it was returning on its track. Impelled by some sort of fascination, I approached the sepulchre to see what it was, and why such a thing stood alone in such a place. I walked around it, and read over the Doric door, in German, Countess Doligen of Grotzen, Styria, sought and found death, 1801. Most scholars believe that this countess's name and the fact that she's from Styria is an homage to Carmilla, which came out in 1872, a couple decades before Bram Stoker was writing Dracula, which he did borrow from. And for him to put in a Carmilla Easter egg in a draft of his book is pretty cool. Carmilla's real name being Countess Malarka Karnstein of Styria. And Carmilla has a standing tomb in a ruined graveyard, too. Sought and found death. I wonder, does that mean she committed suicide? She's not buried at the crossroads like the other suicides, but she was a countess, so, she gets tomb privileges. On the top of the tomb, seemingly driven through the solid marble, for the structure was composed of a few vast blocks of stone, was a great iron spike, or stake. On going to the back, I saw graven in great Russian letters, "The dead travel fast." "The dead travel fast" is a quote that is also in Dracula, and the quote is from an old German poem called Lenore, which is one of the very first Death and the Maiden poems, where Lenore is waiting for her boyfriend to come back from war, and she thinks he does, and he takes her on this wild horse ride. Only it turns out, surprise, it's not her boyfriend's dead. It's Death himself, who has swept Lenore off into a dancing graveyard full of dead people. I love Death and the Maiden stories. The same Lenore was also the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's Lenore, and also the Lenore and the Raven. And this quote, "The dead travel fast," is in Dracula, as we know it. So, if this was originally the first chapter of Dracula just chopped off, it wouldn't have had the dead travel fast here and in the version of Dracula, so this was probably just reworked into Dracula. In Dracula as we know it, when Jonathan Harker is in the carriage with all the other local people that's taking him to Dracula's castle, and it's supposed to drop him off at this place where Dracula's driver is supposed to meet him. The coach gets there early and fast because they're like, hey, Jonathan, look, the guy you're supposed to meet isn't here. Guess you missed him. You better come home with us and stay safe. But then Dracula does drive up and he's like, ha, 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 you are trying to trick my guest into thinking I wasn't coming. And then someone in the coach whispers, the dead travel fast. And Dracula overhears it and he's like, yes, we do. But in Dracula's guess, the dead travel fast is engraved in great Russian letters on Countess of Styria's tomb. There was something so weird and uncanny about the whole thing that it gave me a turn. It made me feel quite faint. I began to wish for the first time that I had taken Johann's advice. Oh, getting caught in a snowstorm wasn't enough to make you scared, but seeing the dead travel fast written on a tomb is, well, I guess you're finally coming to some sense. Here, a thought struck me, which came under almost mysterious circumstances and with a terrible shock. This was Valpurgis Night. He writes it in English here, so I'm saying it in English, not in German. Valpurgis Night, when, according to the belief of millions of people, the devil was abroad, when the graves were opened and the dead came forth and walked, when all evil things of earth and air and water held revel, this very place the driver had specially shunned. This was the depopulated village of centuries ago. This was where the suicide lay, and this was the place where I was alone, unmanned, shivering with cold in a shroud of snow with a wild storm gathering upon me. It took all my philosophy, all the religion I had been taught, all my courage not to collapse in a paroxysm of fright. And now a perfect tornado burst upon me. The ground shook as though thousands of horses thundered across it, and this time the storm bore on its icy wings not snow, but great hailstones, which drove with such violence that they might have come from the thongs of Balearic slingers, hailstones that beat down leaf and branch and made the shelter of the cypresses of no more avail than though their stems were standing corn. At the first I had rushed to the nearest tree, but I was soon fain to leave it and seek the only spot that seemed to afford refuge, the deep Doric doorway of the marble tomb. There, crouching against the massive bronze door, I gained a certain amount of protection from the beating of the hailstones, for now they only drove against me as they ricocheted from the ground and the side of the marble. As I leaned against the door, it moved slightly and opened inwards. The shelter of even a tomb was welcome in the pitiless tempest, and I was about to enter it when there came a flash of forked lightning that lit up the whole expanse of the heavens. In the instant, as I am a living man, I saw, as my eyes were turned into the darkness of the tomb, a beautiful woman, with rounded cheeks and red lips, seemingly sleeping on a bier. As the thunder broke overhead, I was grasped as if by the hand of a giant and hurled out into the storm. The whole thing was so sudden that before I could realize the shock, moral as well as physical, I found the hailstones beating me down. At the same time, I had a strange, dominating feeling that I was not alone. I looked towards the tomb. Just then, there came another blinding flash, which seemed to strike the iron stake that surmounted the tomb, and to pour through to the earth, blasting and crumbling the marble as if in a burst of flame. The dead woman rose for a moment of agony, while she was lapped in the flame, and her bitter scream of pain was drowned in the thunder crash. The last thing I heard was the mingling of dreadful sound, as again I was seized in the giant grasp and dragged away, while the hailstones beat on me, and the air around seemed reverberant with the howling of wolves. The last sight that I remembered was a vague white moving mass, as if all the graves around me had sent out the phantoms of their sheeted dead, and that they were closing in on me through the white cloudiness of the driving hail. Well, that's exciting. So he almost fell in the door to the tomb, where there was clearly a vampire sleeping because the dead lady in the tomb had round cheeks and bloody lips. But then a force of God, a hand that felt like a giant, pulled him away from it just as lightning struck it, exploded the tomb, made the woman inside scream as her whole tomb crumbled down on top of her. And then it seemed like all the ghosts rose out of the graves of the graveyard and went dancing past him, sounding very much like Fantasia, Valpurgis Night, Night on Bald Mountain sequence. That's hot. Can you blame this guy for passing out? Gradually, there came a sort of vague beginning of consciousness. Then a sense of weariness that was dreadful. For a time I remembered nothing, but slowly my senses returned. My feet seemed positively racked with pain, yet I could not move them. They seemed to be numbed. There was an icy feeling at the back of my neck and all down my spine and ears, like my feet were dead, yet in torment. But there was in my breast a sense of warmth, which was, by comparison, delicious. It was as a nightmare, a physical nightmare, if one may use such an expression, for some heavy weight on my chest made it difficult for me to breathe. This period of semi-lethargy seemed to remain a long time, and as it faded away, I must have slept or swooned. Then came a sort of loathing, like the first stage of seasickness, and a wild desire to be free from something, I knew not what. A vast stillness enveloped me, as though all the world were asleep or dead, only broken by the low panting as if of some animal close to me. I felt a warm rasping at my throat. Then came a consciousness of the awful truth, which chilled me to the heart and sent the blood surging up through my brain. Some great animal was lying on me and now licking my throat. I feared to stir, for some instinct of prudence bade me lie still, but the brute seemed to realize that there was now some change in me, for it raised its head. Through my eyelashes, I saw above me the two great flaming eyes of a gigantic wolf. Its sharp white teeth gleamed in the gaping red mouth, and I could feel its hot breath fierce and acrid upon me. For another spell of time I remembered no more. Then I became conscious of a low growl, followed by a yelp, renewed again and again. Then, seemingly very far away, I heard a "Halloa! Halloa!" as of many voices calling in unison. Cautiously, I raised my head and looked in the direction whence the sound came, but the cemetery blocked my view. The wolf still continued to yelp in a strange way, and a red glare began to move round the grove of cypresses, as though following the sound. As the voices drew closer, the wolf yelped faster and louder. I feared to make either sound or motion. Nearer came the red glow, over the white pall which stretched into the darkness around me. Then, all at once from beyond the trees, there came a trot of a troop of horsemen bearing torches. The wolf rose from my breast and made for the cemetery. I saw one of the horsemen, soldiers by their caps and their long military cloaks, raise his carbine and take aim. A companion knocked up his arm, and I heard the ball whiz over my head. He had evidently taken my body for that of the wolf. Another sighted the animal as it slunk away, and a shot followed. Then, at a gallop, the troop rode forward, some towards me, other following the wolf as it disappeared amongst the snow-clad cypresses. As they drew nearer, I tried to move, but was powerless, although I could see and hear all that went on around me. 2 or 3 of the soldiers jumped from their horses and knelt beside me. One of them raised my head and placed his hand over my heart. "Good news, comrades," he cried. "His heart still beats." Then some brandy was poured down my throat. It put vigor into me, and I was able to open my eyes fully and look around. Lights and shadows were moving among the trees, and I heard men call to one another. They drew together, uttering frightened exclamations, and the lights flashed as the others came pouring out of the cemetery, pell-mell like men possessed. When the further ones came close to us, those who were around me asked them eagerly, "Well, have you found him?" The reply rang out hurriedly, "No, no! Come away quick, quick! This is no place to stay, and on this of all nights." "What was it?" was the question asked in all manner of keys. The answer came variously and all indefinitely, as though the men were moved by some common impulse to speak, yet were restrained by some common fear from giving in their thoughts. It, indeed," gibbered one, whose wits had plainly given out for the moment. "A wolf, and yet not a wolf," another put in shudderingly. "No use trying for him without the sacred bullet," a third remarked in a more ordinary manner. "Serve us right for coming out on this night. Truly we have earned our 1,000 marks," were ejaculations from a fourth. "There was blood on the broken marble," another said after a pause. "The lightning never brought that there, and for him, is he safe? Look at his throat. See, comrades, the wolf has been lying on him and keeping his blood warm." The officer looked at my throat and replied, "He is all right. The skin is not pierced. What does it all mean? We should have never found him but for the yelping of the wolf. What became of it? asked the man who was holding up my head and who seemed the least panic-stricken of the party, for his hands were steady and without tremor. On his sleeve was the chevron of the petty officer. "It went to its home," answered the man, whose long face was pallid and who actually shook with terror as he glanced around him fearfully. "There are graves enough there in which it may lie. Come, comrades, come quickly. Let us leave this cursed spot." So it's unclear whether our little hero here understands what these guys are talking about, but they believe the wolf was not a wolf, but demon, vampire, shapeshifter, whatever. The thought of a vampire transforming into a wolf is something that Bram Stoker was very keen on. We see Dracula do it in Dracula. And we know that Bram Stoker used a werewolf legend reference book as influence when he was writing Dracula. And the werewolf legend was actually very common in Iceland. And actually, Icelandophilia was a big thing going on in England at the time, so a lot of people were into Norse mythology, the Swedish werewolf legends, the Icelandic fetishization that was going on. So that Bram Stoker had a secret thing with the guy who translated Powers of Darkness, and it came such a thing in Iceland. You know, it's all connected. Werewolves, legends, Iceland. It was the cool exotic place at the time. So these locals think this werewolf has gone back to its grave because it's a demon that emerged from its grave on Valpurgis Nacht, but they also think that the werewolf yelped to them to help them find Harker and sat on Harker to keep him from getting frostbite. His feet were freezing, but his chest was warm because the wolf was lying on him and licking his neck, keeping him from freezing to death in the snowstorm. So this wolf saved his life, but yet they were running after it and trying to shoot it anyway. In one of the drafts of Dracula that was discovered years after Bram Stoker died, there's a line where Jonathan Harker says in Dracula's castle that his neck still hurts from where the wolf was licking him, even though this part with the wolf isn't in that draft at all. So it's possible that this was the original beginning of that story, and that line was left in, and then when Bram Stoker was editing it into the final version that Dracula came to be, he saw that line, he was like, oh right, better cut that out. So it's not in the Dracula that we know now. But it was in one of the drafts, so this was part of Dracula at some point. The officer raised me into a sitting posture as he uttered a word of command, then several men placed me upon a horse. He sprang to the saddle behind me, took me in his arms, gave the word to advance, and turning our faces away from the cypresses, we rode away swift military order. As yet my tongue refused its office, and I was perforce silent. I must have fallen asleep, for the next thing I remembered was finding myself standing up, surrounded by a soldier on each side of me. It was almost broad daylight, and to the north a red streak of sunlight was reflected like a path of blood over the waste of snow. The officer was telling the men to say nothing of what they had seen, except that they found an English stranger guarded by a large dog. "Dog! That was no dog," cut in the man who had exhibited such fear. "I think I know a wolf when I see one." The young officer answered calmly, "I said a dog." "Dog!" reiterated the other ironically. It was evident that his courage was rising with the sun, and pointing to me, he said, "Look at his throat. Is that the work of a dog, master?" Instinctively, I raised my hand to my throat, and as I touched it, I cried out in pain. The men crowded round to look, some stooping down from their saddles, and again there came the calm voice of the young officer. "A dog, as I said. If aught else were said, we should only be laughed at." I was then mounted behind a trooper, and we rode on into the suburbs of Munich. Here we came across a stray carriage, into which I was lifted, and it was driven off to the Quatre Saisons, the young officer accompanying me, whilst a trooper followed with a horse, and the others rode off to their barracks. When we arrived, Herr Delbruck rushed so quickly down the steps to meet me that it was apparent he had been watching within. Taking me by both hands, he solicitously led me in. The officer saluted me and was turning to withdraw when I recognized his purpose and insisted that he should come to my rooms. Over a glass of wine, I warmly thanked him and his brave comrades for saving me. He replied simply that he was more than glad, and that Herr Delbruck had at the first taken steps to make all the searching party pleased, at which ambiguous utterance the maitre d'hotel smiled, while the officer pleaded duty and withdrew. "But Herr Delbruck," I inquired, "how and why was it that the soldiers searched for me?" He shrugged his shoulders, as if in depreciation of his own deed, and he replied, "I was so fortunate as to obtain leave from the commander of the regiment in which I served to ask for volunteers." But how did you know I was lost? I asked. The driver came hither with the remains of his carriage, which had been upset when the horses ran away. But surely you would not send a search party of soldiers merely on this account. Oh, no, he answered. But even before the coachman arrived, I had a telegram from the boyar whose guest you are. He means Dracula. And he took from his pocket a telegram which he handed to me, and I read, Biswitz, be careful of my guest. His safety is most precious to me. Should aught happen to him, or if he be missed, spare nothing to find him and ensure his safety. He is English, and therefore adventurous. There are often dangers from snow and wolves and night. Lose not a moment if you suspect harm to him. I answer your zeal with my fortune. Dracula. As I held the telegram in my hand, the room seemed to whirl around me, and, if the attentive maitre d'hotel had not caught me, I think I should have fallen. There was something so strange in all this, something so weird and impossible to imagine, that there grew on me a sense of my being in some way the sport of opposite forces, the mere vague idea of which seemed in a way to paralyze me. I was certainly under some form of mysterious protection. From a distant country had come, in the very nick of time, a message that took me out of the danger of the snow sleep and the jaws of the wolf. The end. So he's freaking out because he, of his own will, wandered off, got into a dumb situation, got caught in a snowstorm, almost caught frostbite, almost got electrocuted by lightning striking a tomb that had a mysterious dead lady in it who screamed, who, she was a vampire, probably would have eaten him. And then a hand that felt like a magic force pulled him back from it, and then he woke up to a wolf lying on him, licking him, that saved him from frostbite and called rescuers to come find him. All because Dracula, all the way from Transylvania, had sent a telegram to the guy in charge of the hotel to tell him, by the way, you might want to send some soldiers to go look for Jonathan. He's in trouble. Mysterious indeed. How did Dracula know? So the story's called Dracula's Guest, even though he's not actually a guest at Dracula's house yet, though he's on his way to be Dracula's guest. And Dracula isn't even in the story beyond his telegram, and unless we are to believe that the strange thin man who scared the horses is a vampire, and perhaps even the same vampire who turned into the wolf that saved his life, and the woman sleeping in the tomb is a vampire, there aren't really any vampires in this vampire story either. But being that Dracula's Guest is in the public domain and people milk Dracula content endlessly, you have to wonder, how come it's never been adapted? Well, it has. It's just not in any good way you've heard of. But the interesting story about that is that after Universal adapted Dracula into the famous 1931 Bela Lugosi movie, and they were thinking about sequels, someone from a different studio bought the rights to Dracula's Guest, and he's like, haha, I'm going to scoop this out from under Universal. And that didn't go so well because rights, and you couldn't use any reference to any Dracula thing ever, otherwise Universal would sue you. But he wound up making money off of it anyway. And what he did with his treatment of Dracula's Guest was he wrote a script for a sequel to Dracula about a female vampire. And then this female vampire, inspired by the lady in the tomb in Dracula's Guest, was the only part of Dracula's Guest that actually made it into the script. And this eventually turned out to be the movie Dracula's Daughter. And the thing about the female vampire that they were excited about back in the 1930s was that with a female vampire seducing men, instead of Dracula seducing women, you could make a movie a lot sexier to get past the censors. So even though none of the plot of Dracula's Guest remained, that inspiration of, hey, there's a lady vampire lying in that tomb, what could we do with a lady vampire, led to the rather fabulous film Dracula's Daughter, starring Gloria Holden, 1936, which you should watch. She made my list of top 10 female vampires. She would still be on that list, even though I changed some of it since I made it so many years ago. Some scholars believe that the vampire babe that Harker hooks up with in Powers of Darkness and has repeated encounters with, unlike the brides that he rejects in the Dracula, which we know, is supposed to be the same lady vampire as in Dracula's Guest, who gets struck by lightning and buried in her tomb and screams, even though she's in Munich and the others are in Transylvania. There's also, in Powers of Darkness, this whole section where Dracula's got all these like portraits on his walls that show like Napoleonic royalty type people. And there's like Empress Josephine there. They think that that might be the same countess person. Because how many female vampires could there possibly be? They must all be the same lady. But yeah, when they were developing Dracula's daughter, the exciting thing was that she could seduce men and they could make a much sexier movie that the censors wouldn't allow Dracula to seduce innocent, pretty young ingenue girls in the Dracula films, so that we would get a much sexier movie out of it. And eventually the censors kind of cracked down and they had to make the script less sexy. But that whole double standard with men seducing women versus women seducing men, it's a good thing vampire movies aren't restricted by the censors anymore. Equal opportunity murderous seduction for all. So that was Dracula's Guest. It's light on plot, but it's got a lot of atmosphere. I love the graveyard, the snow, the ghosts, the Valpurgis Night, the lightning, the tomb exploding, the vampire woman screaming. How close Harker came to a vampire encounter, that he starts off as this arrogant Englishman who's like, Valpurgis Nacht means nothing to Englishmen, and by the end, he knows. But I can see why it wasn't included in Dracula ultimately, because Jonathan kind of goes through that whole journey again anyway with Dracula of slowly realizing the horror upon him. If he had already come to that realization, that horrifying situation before he even got to Dracula's castle, it would negate a lot of the impact. So Dracula is definitely stronger as a book without this Dracula's Guest being any part of it. And we still got to keep the best parts, the dead travel fast reference, good stuff. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and if you enjoyed this vampire read-through, let me know what other public domain, copyright-free vampire stories you'd be interested in discussing together during this time when I am unable to write scripts for proper vampire reviews. Vampire reviews will return in their usual form once school is back in session and my fledgling spawn doesn't need constant attention. Stories make everyone happy. My Patreon patrons for supporting my channel. You make all of my vampire nonsense possible. After my last vampire read-through, a lot of people requested that we do Carmilla, and Carmilla would be great. Female vampires, yes. However, it is rather long. It's about 25,000 words, so it would probably take me about 6 videos to get through. You up for that? I'm ready if you are. If you'd like to help me make more videos, please consider supporting me on Patreon. If you can't do that, like this video, leave me a comment for the algorithm gods, subscribe to my channel, tell your friends, follow me on Twitter, follow me everywhere into the night.